The Secret Names Only They Knew, November 1991, a small chapel in West London. 35 people sitting in silence. Outside, millions crying while listening to the radio. And inside, Elton John holding Brian May's hand so tightly his knuckles had gone white, because some goodbyes don't just break your heart. They shatter the entire world you built with someone over 20 years. This is the story of Sharon and Molina, two names almost nobody knew. Two names that meant everything. The funeral was exactly what Freddie Mercury had wanted. No spectacle, no cameras, no performance. Just the people who actually loved him, gathering in a modest chapel to say goodbye to a man the entire world was mourning, but only 35 people truly knew. Elton had walked into that chapel looking like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. His eyes were swollen nearly shut from crying. His famous flamboyance had completely vanished, replaced by raw grief that made him move like every step required conscious effort. He couldn't even walk straight. Roger Taylor had to guide him to his seat beside Brian May. When he sat down, Brian immediately took his hand. Neither man spoke. What was there to say? The person who'd connected them, who'd made them laugh until their sides hurt, who'd filled rooms with impossible energy and music and life. That person was gone. Elton would later say he couldn't remember most of the service, just fragments. Aretha Franklin's voice filling the chapel because Freddie had loved her. Opera arias rising toward the ceiling because Freddie had studied them obsessively. Mary Austin's face composed but devastated, making sure every detail matched Freddie's final wishes. And the crushing awareness that he would never again hear Freddie answer the phone and say, in that distinctive voice, "Sharon, darling, where have you been?" Because Elton John wasn't Elton to Freddie, he was Sharon. And Freddie Mercury wasn't Freddie to Elton, he was Molina. These weren't just nicknames, they were a secret language, a private world that existed only between two people who understood something essential about each other that nobody else could see. To understand how profound that was, you need to go back. Back to mid-1970s London, when the music scene was small enough that everyone who mattered knew each other, but big enough that real friendship was still rare. Back to a party, probably 1974 or early 1975, where two men who were already becoming legends met for the first time. Elton John was at the peak of his powers. His albums were selling millions. His concerts were spectacles of piano-driven rock and outrageous costumes. He'd become exactly what he'd set out to be. Impossible to ignore, impossible to categorize, impossible to forget. Freddie Mercury and Queen were on the verge of something extraordinary. Killer Queen had announced them as serious contenders. Bohemian Rhapsody was about to change music history forever. Freddie was still finding his persona, still discovering what it meant to command a stage the way he was born to do. When these two met at that party, something clicked that neither could quite explain later. Maybe it was recognizing someone else who understood what it meant to perform. To put on a costume, literal and metaphorical, and become larger than life, because being your regular-sized self didn't feel like enough. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe two people who spent their entire lives feeling like they didn't quite fit anywhere suddenly found someone who fit perfectly beside them. The friendship that grew from that first meeting wasn't about music, though they shared that. It wasn't about fame, though they both drowned in it. It was about something more fundamental: recognition. Two people who saw through each other's spectacular exteriors to the actual humans underneath. And instead of being disappointed by what they found there, they loved it. That's where Sharon and Molina came from. Nobody knows the exact origin of the names. Some people claim they came from old movie characters. Others insisted they emerged during a night of outrageous partying that both men found hilarious but never fully explained. The truth is, it doesn't matter where the names came from. What mattered was what they meant. They meant, when you're with me, you don't have to perform. You can just be yourself. Think about what that meant for two people whose entire lives were performance. Elton John couldn't walk down a street without being recognized. Freddie Mercury couldn't have a private moment without someone wanting a piece of him. Every relationship was complicated by fame, by expectation, by people wanting something from them. But Sharon and Molina didn't want anything from each other except honesty. When Freddie called Elton's house and someone else answered, he'd ask, "Is Sharon there?" When Elton spotted Freddie across a crowded room at some industry event, he'd call out, "Molina," and watch Freddie's face light up with genuine pleasure. These weren't just cute nicknames. They were a kind of permission. Permission to drop the mask. Permission to be tired, confused, scared, human. Permission to exist without the weight of being Freddie Mercury or Elton John. The friendship deepened throughout the late 70s and early 80s. Outwardly, their careers seemed to diverge. Elton's music stayed rooted in piano-driven pop and rock. Queen pushed into territories nobody had explored, opera rock, multi-tracked harmonies, songs that didn't follow any conventional structure. But instead of creating distance, these differences strengthened their bond. They weren't competitors. They were artists who respected what the other was trying to do, even when, especially when, it was completely different from their own work. What they shared was something else entirely. The paradox of super fame. Being adored by millions while sometimes feeling profoundly alone. Having everyone want a piece of you while feeling like nobody sees the actual you. Living under constant pressure to top yourself, to stay relevant, to keep being the larger-than-life person everyone expects. These were things they could only really talk about with each other, because only someone living it could truly understand. So they talked. For hours. At parties that lasted until dawn. At Freddie's Garden Lodge home in Kensington, where the guest list was always exclusive, and the music was always loud, and the laughter was always genuine. Elton was there for nearly all of it, and Freddie was there for Elton's equally legendary gatherings. People who witnessed these nights remembered them decades later, not because of the spectacle, though there was always spectacle, but because of the moments when Freddie and Elton would end up at the piano together. Sometimes they'd play dueling versions of the same song, trying to make each other laugh. Sometimes they'd collaborate on ridiculous improvisations. Sometimes they'd just sit side by side, playing whatever came to mind, not performing for anyone except each other. Those moments revealed something their millions of fans never got to see. Two friends who genuinely delighted in each other's company, who made each other laugh until they cried, who could be completely themselves without judgment or expectation. Mary Austin, who knew Freddie better than almost anyone, once commented that Elton was one of the few people who could make Freddie completely relax. When Elton was around, Freddie didn't have to be Freddie Mercury. He could just be Freddie, or Molina, and that was rare for him. By the late 1980s, something was changing. People close to Freddie noticed it first. He was withdrawing slightly, not from music. Queen was still recording, still creating, but from the constant social whirl that had defined so much of his life. The parties at Garden Lodge became smaller, more selective. The guest list shrank to only people Freddie truly cared about. The atmosphere shifted from spectacular to intimate. Those who loved Freddie understood something was happening, even if they didn't know exactly what. There was a deliberateness to how he spent his time now. Every conversation seemed to matter more. Every gathering felt more precious. Elton noticed. Of course he noticed. Sharon always noticed when something was different with Molina. His visits to Garden Lodge increased and changed. Instead of arriving for parties, he'd come for quiet afternoons. They'd sit in Freddie's garden, surrounded by the flowers Freddie loved obsessively. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence. Elton started bringing flowers every time he visited. Elaborate arrangements that he knew Freddie would love. Freddie's face would light up like a child's when Elton walked in carrying yet another ridiculous bouquet. "Sharon, you're going to fill my entire house with flowers," Freddie would say, laughing. "That's the plan, Molina," Elton would reply. Those visits became some of the most important moments of Elton's life, though he didn't fully realize it at the time. Or maybe he did. Maybe that's why he kept coming, even when the visits became harder. Even when saying goodbye at the end of each afternoon started to feel heavier, because each goodbye carried the unspoken question, will this be the last time? The final visit happened in late 1991. Freddie was tired. The disease that would take his life had ravaged his body, though his spirit remained stubbornly, impossibly intact. He was choosing who to see carefully now, conserving energy, spending time only with people who mattered most. When Elton arrived and was shown into Freddie's room, Freddie's face transformed. For a moment, the exhaustion lifted. "Sharon," he said, and that single word carried 20 years of friendship. They talked for hours, about music, about the past, about nothing and everything. Freddie still had that gift, even in his weakest moments, of making Elton laugh, of finding humor in darkness, of refusing to let the room become heavy with unspoken grief. But when it was time for Elton to leave, both men knew. This wasn't just another goodbye. This was the goodbye. Elton stood beside Freddie's bed, trying to find words adequate to 20 years of friendship, trying to express what it had meant to have someone who knew him as Sharon, who saw past the costumes and the fame to the actual person underneath, who had been, in the truest sense, a friend. He kissed Freddie's forehead, said things he'd carried for years but never quite articulated, told Freddie how much he loved him, how much their friendship had meant, how grateful he was for every ridiculous conversation, every shared laugh, every moment of genuine connection in lives that were otherwise performed for millions. Freddie smiled that famous smile, squeezed Elton's hand, said things back that Elton would carry for the rest of his life. When Elton walked out of Garden Lodge that day, he felt something break inside himself. Sharon was leaving Molina for the last time. On November 23, 1991, Freddie Mercury released a brief public statement acknowledging his illness. 24 hours later, surrounded by the people he loved most, he died at Garden Lodge. He was 45 years old. The news hit Elton like a physical blow, even though he'd known it was coming. Knowing doesn't prepare you. Nothing prepares you for losing someone who occupied such a central place in your life. Molina was gone. That private world, the one that existed only between Sharon and Molina, had just lost half its population. 3 days later, on November 27th, 35 people gathered at West London Crematorium. The service was private, dignified, completely free of the spectacle that had defined both men's public lives. Freddie's Zoroastrian heritage was honored in the ceremony. His family was there, his closest friends, the 3 surviving members of Queen, and Elton John. Elton and Brian May sat shoulder to shoulder through the entire service, holding on to each other because letting go felt impossible, both crying openly. Roger Taylor sat in stunned silence. John Deacon looked like he'd turned to stone. Mary Austin maintained her composure while making sure every detail matched Freddie's final wishes, even as her heart was breaking. Music filled the chapel. Not Queen. Freddie had chosen other pieces. Aretha Franklin's voice, which Freddie had loved his entire life. Opera arias he'd studied and cherished. This was Freddie's final performance, choosing the soundtrack to his own goodbye. Elton would later say he barely remembered the service. Just fragments, the music, Mary's strength, Brian's hand in his, Roger's terrible silence, John's stoned face, and the overwhelming, crushing reality that Freddie was gone. After the service, as people filed out into the gray London afternoon, Elton stood for a moment outside the chapel. He wasn't just saying goodbye to Freddie Mercury, the legend. He was saying goodbye to Molina, to 20 years of private jokes and shared laughter, to someone who'd seen him completely and loved him anyway, to the friendship that had meant more than any amount of fame or success. In the years that followed, Elton became one of the most dedicated keepers of Freddie's memory, not just the public memory, the legendary performer, the iconic frontman, but the private one too, the actual human being who'd been generous and funny and complicated and kind. In interviews, Elton talked about Freddie not as a myth, but as a friend. He shared stories that revealed the person behind the persona. He made sure people understood that Freddie Mercury wasn't just a voice or a performance. He was a human being who'd loved deeply, lived fully, and faced his death with the same courage and grace he'd brought to everything else. In April 1992, Elton performed at the Freddie Mercury tribute concert at Wembley Stadium. 72,000 people in the stadium. Nearly 1 billion watching worldwide. He sang with Queen. He sang Bohemian Rhapsody with the surviving members. He poured 20 years of friendship into every note. But the performance that mattered most to Elton was quieter, more private. In the years after Freddie's death, Elton would sometimes sit at his piano alone and play songs that reminded him of those Garden Lodge nights, those moments when it was just Sharon and Molina, Two friends making music because it was the only language that said everything they needed to say. Freddie's ashes remain in a location known only to Mary Austin. That was his final wish. After a life lived entirely in public, to have at least his death remain private. It's fitting somehow. The man who gave everything to his audience kept one last secret. But Sharon and Molina? That wasn't a secret meant to be kept forever. That was a reminder that even the most public figures need private spaces, need friendships that exist outside the spotlight, need permission to be themselves without performance or pretense. November 1991, a small chapel, 35 people, two hands holding on tight. Elton John wasn't just burying a friend that day. Sharon was saying goodbye to Molina, to a world that had existed only between them, to secret names and private jokes and piano-side laughter that lasted until dawn, to someone who'd seen him completely and loved him anyway. But he was also carrying something forward, everything Freddie had given him, the laughter, the honesty, the permission to be human, the courage to face darkness while still searching for light. Some friendships don't end when someone dies. They just transform. They live on in memory, in music, in the way we carry forward what we learned from loving someone. Sharon and Molina. Two names almost nobody knew. Two names that meant everything. That's what real friendship looks like. Not the public performances or the shared fame, but the private moments, the secret language, the space where two people can drop their masks and just be themselves. Freddie Mercury died in 1991. But Molina lives on every time Elton sits at a piano and remembers those Garden Lodge nights. Every time he tells a story that makes someone understand who Freddie really was. Every time he uses his platform to fight for the causes Freddie cared about. And somewhere, in that private world that existed only between them, Sharon and Molina are still there. Still laughing, still making music, still being exactly who they were to each other. Not legends, not icons, not performers. Just friends, the truest kind.